Welcome to Unchatted Waters. In this episode, we discover how we can harness energy from the planet, from sun, wind, and even tides and waves. We learn how energy has shaped our modern world and the need to balance the impacts and benefits of renewable energy. So hoist that sail and let's explore the power of nature and where it can take us. Welcome to Unchatted Waters, the podcast that talks to the people behind the science. I'm Kirsty Bradley, your host, and I'm excited to take you on a journey of discovery in our new series. I'm excited to introduce the two guests for this episode. Daniel Wood is a principal scientist specialising in renewable energy and how it may impact the environment. His work explores combined impacts on the environment and how we balance this with the benefits of renewable energy. Joe Perry is a senior advisor working on how human activities impact the environment, and his team assess the suitability of activities across different marine sites. Welcome to the podcast, both of you.
Afternoon. Hello.
Great to have you. So, renewable energy, the first question I want to ask is, how do we define renewable energy? And I imagine it's changed a lot over time.
So there's many different terms that have been used over the years to refer to what we like to think of nowadays as renewable energy. You might have heard terms like sustainable energy. Green energy was a really common one. Renewable seems to be the one that has stuck. It's certainly the one that most scientists use, I would argue. But even this term isn't wholly accurate, because if you think of renewable, if you think even oil and gas are technically renewable, just over much longer time spans.
So I actually want to interrupt you there and ask about fossil fuels. How are fossil fuels stored and built up over time so that we can use them?
So the clues in the name with fossil fuels, fossils, essentially, organic matter, marine life, plants which have decayed over time and sort of degraded, and over hundreds of years they essentially become oil and gas through very complex processes to become what is liquid black gold, which is what oil was largely referred to for such a long time, because it's such an effective, efficient resource. That's essentially the reason so many places use it. A useful distinction sometimes with renewable energy, or at least the way I like to think about it, is, are you extracting a resource to produce the energy? Because wind is always occurring. If you have a wind turbine or a wind farm, the wind will turn the blades, you'll generate electricity. That wind has not sort of reduced in any capacity.
It's not stored somewhere.
The same with the waves, the same with the tides. And although we know that they're going to change over time, we see, global circulatory patterns are slowing down in places, speeding up. The tide is still going to come in as long as we have the moon.
I guess it's the same with sun as well, because the sun is hopefully always going to rise and the weather might change the amount of sun we experience. And I guess in terms of how it looks now, wind turbines was one that you referenced. We've been making our own energy for hundreds of years.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. We used to have water mills, so big wheels using the power or the flow of a river. The classic example of a wind turbine, I guess, is based on a windmill. And this wasn't necessarily used for energy as such, but, humanity harnessed the power of wind to grind flour, to use sort of early pre-industrial machinery.
If we've understood where we are now, where did we think it used to be going?
There's a lot of emphasis being put on hydrogen. I think though in investments, though, it is starting to dissipate a little bit. Hydrogen is less amazing once you start looking at it in practical terms than perhaps it's sold to be. The reality of making hydrogen is that you need to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and that requires a vast amount of electricity. The question there is, where do you get the electricity from? Traditionally, it would be burning lots of fossil fuels. So the question there really is, why would you not just use the fossil fuels? And then if you're making a load of electricity, why would you not just use the electricity?
Yeah.
Why would you go to all the extra processes and in reality all the extra cost of making hydrogen when you've already got some perfectly good gas or oil?
Because I remember learning at school, the amazing part of hydrogen is that the emission would be water. Why was it such a draw for us?
In terms of burning hydrogen, if you're just burning hydrogen on its own, the emissions are effectively only water.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that you probably wouldn't just burn hydrogen on your own, you'd mix it with something else, in which case you start to get a load of other nasties coming out, which we don't want. In practical terms, though, producing the hydrogen using fossil fuels creates all of the fossil fuel emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, and all that sort of stuff. In theory, you can capture those emissions using carbon capture storage or similar technologies, but in practice, that's still at the R&D stage, the research stage. No one, as far as I'm aware, has ever really got that working on a commercially viable scale, i.e. where it's not going to cost you a fortune. Now, in theory, you could take excess renewable energy from wind, solar, wave, whatever, and convert that electricity into hydrogen, so you could split it. But again, you've got that question of why wouldn't you just use the electricity to start with?
Yeah.
So you add another layer of complexity and therefore another layer of cost. So again, it comes down to, do people want to pay lots of money for hydrogen?
Right.
The other challenge with hydrogen is not very energy dense, certainly in terms of something like petrol, in terms of a battery. So you need a lot of hydrogen to go somewhere. So you end up with the range.
So what would energy dense mean? Is that just a figure that you have for each fuel, or is it kind of more dynamic than that?
Yes, it's how much energy can you get out of a unit of whatever the energy fuel type you're talking about. So basically, if you were thinking of a car, how far can you go on a full tank of whatever? So petrol's really good at range, battery is probably second, hydrogen's quite low, because it's a light floaty gas that you can't squash energy into that hydrogen.
Okay. So it's a big idea that really fueled our thinking on how we could adapt to a changing world, but it's not really a most practical way of doing it. What we've got now, what we've developed now, is actually going to provide us with what we need.
Yes, and I think there's still lots of people really pushing for hydrogen, but at the moment, the practicalities and the cost of it is just too expensive when you compare it to the cheapness of electricity from wave, solar, wind.
Brilliant. So we've started to ask the question that I wanted to ask next, which is, why do we need renewable energy?
So I think most people would expect me to say something about climate change, but I find in my day-to-day work, we don't really talk about climate change very often. Probably the one that people can most associate with in their day-to-day lives is air pollution. People will perhaps remember the smog from London and from many big cities around the world, Shanghai, Beijing, Delhi, New York. They've all had huge pollution problems.
London as well.
With the pea soup.
Sorry, jargon alarm. What pea soup?
The London smog was referred to as pea soup,
okay.
I believe. And I think the interesting point came when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor in America and recognised that people didn't necessarily either believe in climate change, or it was too big a thing for them to get a grip of, or it was such a big thing they felt it was someone else's problem to solve. Whereas air pollution is something really tangible. People don't want their children breathing in polluted air. So that's really changed a lot of things, particularly around cars moving to electric, in terms of cleaning up the air around us. So I think air pollution is a big factor. Climate change inevitably is a massive driver. The polls around the world show that the majority of people are very concerned about climate change. We see it pretty much daily in terms of forest fire, flooding, lack of rain, too much rain.
It's getting really noticeable now, isn't it? I think even compared to when I was a kid, I notice it much more now. And it's getting more and more close to home, and more people are listening. And if you think about how many electric cars are on the roads nowadays compared to a couple of years ago, even 5 years ago.
There's no credible scientists who would argue against climate change happening. And in many ways now, it doesn't really matter whether you believe in climate change or not, because the insurance industry does. And they're ultimately the ones who are paying for the cost in terms of insuring land against flooding, fire, or something like that. Travel insurance, going on holiday and that sort of things is all being put up. Another really, really important factor, and sometimes that people don't necessarily like to admit, is there's loads of money to be made in the renewable energy transition. It's quite hard to make money out of an old industry. You can only innovate and do so much more before you start to lose your profit margins. In the renewable energy industry, it's been going realistically for 30 years at least, but there's still a long way to go. And that means loads of innovation. With innovation comes costs and expenses and things like that, and that turns into profits and jobs. And the UK is really good at this stuff. We're really good at locking ourselves into a shed, designing something, coming up with new ways of making things, inventing stuff. This is high-tech industries, complicated manufacturing. It's the stuff that the UK really built the Industrial Revolution on. It's the stuff that we really could be doing very, very well. We are still very close to global leaders. We've probably let that slip a little bit to China, but there's no reason we can't be catching up.
So as well as economic growth, which is a phrase we'll hear more and more in the news, we often hear energy security. So what does that actually mean?
In the most rudimentary of terms, it is making sure that we have a secure supply of energy, essentially. And that's because energy is absolutely critical to everything we do. It's not just our workplaces, our offices, the NHS and healthcare systems rely on it, all of our public services, all of our industry. There is no real facet of the economy that doesn't require reliable amounts of energy basically all the time. There are a number of factors that influence energy security. The main thing is that reliability of knowing where we can get it. So historically, countries like in the UK, we burnt a lot of coal. That was the main energy source that we used. It's the main ones a lot of developing nations first turned to during and after the Industrial Revolution, because coal was easy to find. You know, there were coal mines all over the UK. It was easy to dig out the ground. But for many of the reasons that Dan has just outlined, so because of all of those factors, this really sort of drove the move towards renewable energy. The UK was certainly a world leader and is definitely amongst the top now, although we do have competition. Sort of offshore wind, for example, because we're, you know, an island nation, we have really quite strong winds, particularly sort of in the North Sea. So it's almost expected, really, that in a world where this technology exists to harness the power of gales across the sea, the UK should really be harnessing that.
Are you assuming that means we have an independent source of energy? Because what I'm thinking about is when there's conflict in the world, like the Second World War, we had to think about our food security and where our food came from. We had to become more efficient in that time period to make sure that we could feed ourselves. Is it a similar way of considering energy security?
So the historic case of us digging all the coal and using coal is because we had it in England. It was in England and Wales largely. We were able to dig it up and use it. The reason we use so much oil is because, you know, we have vast deposits in the North Sea. And so in a world where, let's say, all of the coal in the UK ran out or all of the oil ran out, this is a hypothetical, of course, we would have had to rely on getting that coal elsewhere. And this was, you know, many years before we all had friendly relationships with other countries, so it wouldn't have been as easy as sort of picking up the phone. There's a lot of complexity there alongside the actual security issues. Having to transport that energy source so many hundreds of miles takes time. It's not necessarily reliable, and it costs much more money than actually producing it yourself in your own sort of area.
So that's why we're thinking about wind and natural resources that we have in order to help secure our future.
Yeah, and our future for, you know, industry, public services, everything, anything you can think of.
So Joe's mentioned wind power quite a lot there. And when I think of wind power, I think of offshore. So how do we use the space around our island nation to set up renewable energy sources?
The one that everyone's probably familiar with is offshore wind. The reason we build them in the sea is because they're really big. If you've ever had the opportunity to go and stand near a wind turbine on land, just looking up at them, there's one sort of a couple of miles from Lowestoft where we're recording here, just going up and looking up it will probably make you feel quite giddy because they are so big. The ones offshore are considerably larger than that. We're sort of into the hundreds of metres.
What, for the blade or for the height?
For the height of the turbine.
Okay.
I mean, we're talking blades the length of football pitches.
Wow.
So we are serious in being impressive in structures and size.
Yeah.
And apart from the better wind resource offshore is a matter of space. This is often an argument as well for floating solar or photovoltaics, as it's sometimes called.
From voltaic, like voltage.
Solar panels, technical term would be a photovoltaic panel.
So what's voltaic mean?
Energy. So photo is light. Voltaic would be energy, so energy from light.
I mean, that sounds very plausible. I've literally never thought of it that way. I've just accepted that's what it's called.
It just sounds like a nice word. Voltaic.
Photovoltaics, floating solar, most commonly talked about in countries that have a quite small land mass but lots of water, so often relatively small islands in the tropics. But in terms of physical space to put solar panels, there's plenty of space in the UK on land. So I don't really see the floating options in the UK really taking off. The other big consideration with offshore is the cost of cabling. The further offshore you put it, the more it costs to cable it. So ideally, you'd put them closer to shore because you'd save the cost of cabling, which obviously then makes the cost of electricity cheaper, which makes people's bills cheaper.
So now I'm going to come over to you, Joe, and ask what some of those renewable energy sources might be if we're not considering the need for space.
There are other methods of renewable energy generation where it's not just about using the space available in the sea, but it's also relying on the, power of the sea. So the power of the tides, the power of the waves, all of that kinetic energy that's just there ready to be harvested. Tidal is one example that I've mentioned. So the tides are predictable. Essentially, with tidal, you develop a turbine and you would place that tidal device where it's going to be influenced by the tide, and the tide will move the turbine. The same with waves. We have all sorts of monitoring data about where the waves are the strongest around the UK and around the world. We could theoretically put wave energy devices all over the country. We could do the same with tidal. There was a lot of talk around different types of tidal energy installations. In the UK, it hasn't gotten off the ground as much as offshore wind. And I think that's largely due to the sheer potential that the UK had for wind, rather than to the detriment of tidal and wave as such.
We have technology level, readiness levels. It's closer to the garden shed than it is at the full commercial scale.
Back to the garden shed. Love it. So that brings me on to the next question, actually. So the considerations for renewable energy. I guess that's one of the first things we need to consider when thinking about making renewable energy possible. Have we got the technology and the expertise there from this big idea to something that is practically useful?
So yes, you're right. Technological availability is often one of the most significant barriers to complex industries. With wind, we fundamentally understand how a wind turbine works. Mm-hmm. We know that from seeing windmills. The question is perhaps less difficult to answer than other technologies. So in the UK, we were able to use those early installations like in Blythe in 2001, the Blythe demonstrator project, to test out turbines. How do they work in the sea? Can we fix them most securely? How big do the blades need to be? How can we transport it from, miles off in the middle of the North Sea to landfall in sort of the middle of Lincolnshire? We've made significant progress, I think, in sort of 20, 24 years.
So once we've got on our checklist, once we've got our technology ticked off, what is the next thing we need to consider when we're installing things like offshore wind?
A sizable chunk of this is the environmental impacts. A lot of people probably have heard the term environmental impact assessment, or EIA. Typically, these are sort of broken down into the construction impacts and then the operational impacts. The construction impacts tend to be all the boats whizzing around, lots of clearing the seabed, removing unexploded Second World War bombs and things like that, through to lots of underwater noise, bashing in big turbine foundations, those sort of concerns and impacts on things like marine mammals, dolphins and whales. And then we move on to the operational impacts, and probably the one that people are most familiar would be collision risk, with birds getting struck by the rotor blades, and also bats potentially as well. We can also add decommissioning impacts onto that as well now. We are starting to see the oldest wind turbines getting to the point where they'll need to be taken out, potentially replaced. So when you've got a structure that's been there for 35 years and it's got all sorts of beasties and creatures growing on the side of it, what's the impact of chopping that turbine down and making all those animals homeless? So we've got to put all of this together and look at the cumulative picture. We tend to focus on the sort of the big bang and you're dead type impacts, but actually a lot of what my work is looking at all of the impacts together. So what about all the little impacts going on in the background? What about the positive benefits? A lot of birds use wind turbines for roosting stations as a resting point.
Really?
So we've got to put all of that together to try and understand what's the overall picture. And this is where I think we need to move the conversation on, because traditionally, when we started building wind turbines, the environmental impact assessment was about demonstrating that there was no adverse impacts and everything was great and we should definitely be building them. Okay. We now know that that's not the case, and we're now building at the scale where there will be impacts, because we're starting to build all across the North Sea, we're building across the Irish and the Celtic Seas, down into the Bay of Biscay. We will definitely have an impact. So what we need to be doing is putting all of those impacts together and saying, what's the overall picture? And then as a society, comparing those impacts against the impacts of fossil fuel, which we know are huge, against the impacts of climate change, which we're pretty certain could be sort of species defining. I've been looking at this topic for nearly 20 years now, and I'm pretty close to convinced that the impacts of offshore wind are far, far less than the impacts of fossil fuels and the impacts of climate change. But I think as a society, we need to properly look at that conversation and have it and agree together that this is the right way forward.
So one thing you said there in your answer was the way that older turbines have become a habitat for animals potentially. So Joe, do you want to give us a bit of detail on what that might look like and how wind turbines potentially benefit the nature around them?
Yeah, of course. A wind turbine is essentially a hard piece of substrate. When you put it on the seabed, it's metal, it's designed not to degrade. They want them to stay that way for 25, I think up to 50 years now in the sea. As well as the actual turbine itself, you often have to protect the cables that you're putting down, or even the actual turbine foundations themselves. And one way of doing this is to essentially surround or cover the cables or cable interconnectors, any sort of structure that you're trying to protect. You basically just cover them in really big rocks and boulders. The reason you do this is you're trying to protect against wave-driven erosion. And when you place a nice big pile of boulders, you actually get quite a nice structure. We're a little unsure whether this is a true sort of increase in biomass that we're sort of indicatively starting to see, or whether it's fish that would have otherwise gone elsewhere.
So it might just be displaced.
Yeah. But it's an interesting concept. There's a lot of debate in sort of ecological literature, but also in the socioeconomic literature as well, with respect to how do we manage the placement of offshore wind and fisheries, because you don't want to displace one over the other, but there might actually be co-benefits as well. We're not really confident on that yet, but there's definitely potential there to explore.
Even understanding the marine environment before we start adding to it is hard enough to understand. So understanding what's happening once we add something to it is a growing form of research. So what do we think the future could look like for renewable energy?
I think firstly we're on a tipping point in terms of public perception. You've only got to walk around your neighbourhood and see how many of your neighbours have got solar panels now, how many people have got electric cars. People are transitioning to renewable energy and low voluntarily because it's cheaper. That in turn makes people far more accepting of renewable energy, and as more and more people get it, people become more and more aware of the benefits, and I think that moves to a greater acceptance of offshore wind and offshore renewables in general. I think some of the projections of how many wind farms we'll get will probably come down just because of economics and supply chains and things like that, but also because wind turbines are getting bigger, more efficient. You need fewer wind turbines now for the amount of electricity. Secondly, I think we're starting to see some quite significant changes in the science behind it, better ways of assessing environmental impacts, more join up between the different disciplines, so joining up between birds and fish, because birds eat fish and you can't really understand the impacts of offshore wind farms on birds unless you understand the impacts on their food and the fish and that sort of things as well. More understanding of the holistic, sort of the big picture of what's going on in the ecosystems, and much more collaboration across governments and across countries. The UK shares its borders with France, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark and many others. So we're going to have to be able to understand the impacts across these borders, because the birds, the mammals, the fish, they don't take any notice of borders, they're unaware of them.
Yeah, I feel like we've said that a lot in this podcast. Like fish and animals don't care about borders, so it's all about international collaboration.
Going off what Dan says, and to sort of continue the optimism, and I do think that's realistic as well. I think we'll probably start to see a more diverse mix of renewable options. The key thing we discussed was the challenge of space. And yes, we've got lots of marine space in the UK, but wind farms are often dependent on the depth of water that you have. You need to be able to connect them. So I think we'll probably start to see more attention be put on things like potentially multi-use platforms where you try to sort of like aquaculture attached to a wind turbine generator, or coastal as well, aquaculture with tidal, for example. It's mostly aquaculture that we tend to see because that's also a growing sector. But I think that's one of the most interesting areas we might start to see. But there's also more experimental methods of generating electricity. Can we use thermoclines? So can we use the difference between really cold water and really hot water to try to generate some form of ocean thermal energy conversion? It's all very exciting and experimental.
So that leads us on to the final feature of our episode today, which is our fun fact, which I like to refer to as a nugget of information. And I really want to coin that phrase now. So I'm going to call it a treasure for this series, a little jewel or coin or nugget of information that we've collected on this journey of discovery that is really something the listener can hold on to and take to their friends to tell them about this really important topic. So I'm hoping that you each have a medallion or something with you that you brought along for this journey of discovery. Who wants to go first?
I think the point I'd like to leave listeners pondering is that we regularly hear in just about every newspaper that it's not windy all the time, it's not sunny all the time. Therefore, renewable energies can never be the future. And I would counter that with it doesn't rain all the time, but you go to the tap and there's water because we store it in reservoirs. And the missing part of the puzzle to date has been the energy storage. And the technology advancements, the cost reductions on those technologies really mean that we have now solved that problem. And as we start increasing the energy storage within this country, as they're doing in America, Australia, China, there really is no cost-effective or sensible alternative to renewable energy.
Who knows where we'll end up?
Yeah.
Right, Joe, it's your turn.
Similar to Dan, I guess, on it's not windy all the time or it's not sunny all the time. We think of classic British weather as quite grey, quite wet. And you do hear a common sort of criticism of solar is, well, the UK gets 2 days of sun a year. What's the point of putting it here? To which you should probably say, well, just because it's overcast doesn't mean you can't generate solar energy, because it's about daylight. It's not necessarily about direct blinding sunlight. Just because you can't directly see the sun does not mean that those solar cells are not generating electricity. And actually the UK, because it can get so windy, I believe that can actually help cool down the solar cells as they are converting the electricity, because the cells get hot when they do it. So the UK could actually be,
on the sunny side of this.
On the sunny side of this equation.
Yeah. Really great episode. Really interesting, really mind-opening as well. And I just want to thank you for taking the time today to speak to me and the listeners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was made by CEFAS, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. To keep up to date with us, follow us on social media using @CEFASGovUK. We hope you can join us again next time.